1 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, if you have a heading like I do, it says, Food Offered to Idols. This is not just chapter 8, but this is actually chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. In fact, generally, you would see listed in an outline chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 1. So 3 chapters in some way dealing with this subject of food offered to idols. Chapter 8, verse 1 begins, now concerning. Last week we made mention of these 2 words because it's kind of a signaling that, well, the church there had asked Paul about some things. You find it in chapter 7, verse 1, as he begins to talk about marriage. You find it in chapter 7, verse 25, as he speaks of the virgins or those betrothed. You find it here as concerning food offered to idols. And you find it in chapter 12, verse 4, concerning spiritual gifts. And you find it in chapter 16, verse 1, now concerning the collection. So various subjects introduced by this now concerning. They had questions. They wanted things clarified. You know what? When we have questions, when we need better understanding, it's good to ask. We can't ask directly the Apostle Paul as they could. But now one thing we can do is we can take out our Bibles and just start reading, or in a more pointed way, take out a concordance and look up those words relating to the subject that you have a question about. Or more easily done today with a Bible program on your computer. And by the way, eSword's a very good program and is available for free. You can do a search for those words, just click and there it is. And in that way you can say, okay, Paul, what about? Or Jesus, what about? A great way to be asking questions and going to Paul or to Jesus for the answer. Well, he says, now concerning food offered to idols. We know that all possess knowledge. Now this is in quotation marks, so it may be that this was something kind of currently said among the Corinthian brethren. All of us possess knowledge. Then he says this knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Now, he is not denigrating the idea of knowing or having knowledge. Jesus said, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. In Acts 2, as Peter was preaching on the day of Pentecost, as he comes to the conclusion, he says that they are to know assuredly or know for certain that God has made that same Jesus whom you've crucified both Lord and Christ. So I see Jesus then Peter saying, you better know the truth. Know that Jesus has been crucified and is now Lord and Christ. But you find it even further in Colossians 1, verse 9. As Paul's writing to the Colossian brethren, he says, and so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you might be filled with the knowledge of His will. So the idea of them being knowledgeable was a part of his prayer. And even as you go back even to this church at Corinth, in chapter 1 and verse 5, he says, that in every way you are enriched in Him in all speech and all knowledge. And about 5 times in Paul's epistles, he says, I want you to know. So when I read this here about knowledge, I don't need to walk away thinking that, well, knowledge is not good. No, we need knowledge. But now, this knowledge puffs up. If a man just thinks himself to have knowledge, Sometimes he thinks he has more knowledge than he does. Or maybe he's got knowledge and he throws his shoulders back. He's a bit proud of it. He's got the knowledge and he comes across as a know-it-all. And most of the time, if someone comes across as a know-it-all, we kind of take a step back. This chapter and the next two, they are about building up, strengthening, and encouraging, and caring, and loving the brethren, not being offensive. So verse 2, if anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. Look at that again. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not know as he ought to know. I wrote beside this, just my own words. I wrote, you do not know as much as you think you do. That's probably all too true. We do not know as much as we think we do. And so, while knowledge is to be desired and we should seek to attain it, let's put on the brakes. Let's be careful that the knowledge that we think we have does not in some way present itself in a discouraging, offensive way to a brother. Verse 3, if anyone loves God, he is known by God. That God knows those who are his, you find in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. Now verse 4. Remember, this whole subject is eating food offered to idols. And now he moves from just knowledge to the idea of the idols. Verse 4. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols. So right at this moment, he's not really discussing the eating as much as he is the idols. He says, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. Turn over, if you got your Bible, please turn to Isaiah 44. Isaiah 44. And we're going to read a passage at a bit of length. That's why I say please turn there. Isaiah 44. The idols are nothing passage is Isaiah chapter 44. And verses 9 through 20 discuss the nothingness of these idols. Starting in verse 9, Isaiah 44 verse 9. All who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Their witnesses neither see nor know, that they may be put to shame. Who fashions a god or casts an idol that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his companions shall be put to shame, and the craftsmen are only human. Let them all assemble, let them stand forth. They shall be terrified, they shall be put to shame together. Kind of walk away here, it's just like, wait, men make the idols? How can the idols be anything if man makes them? Then he goes on to describe some of this. Verse 12. The ironsmith makes a cutting tool and works it over the coals. He fashions it with hammers and works it with his strong arm. He becomes hungry and his strength fails. He drinks no water and is faint. Then he turns from the ironsmith to the carpenter. He says the carpenter stretches a line. He marks it out with a pencil. He shapes it with planes and marks it with a compass. He shapes it into the figure of a man with the beauty of a man to dwell in a house. He cuts down cedars, or he chooses a cypress tree or an oak, or lets it grow strong among the trees of the forest. He plants a cedar and the rain nourishes it. So, once again, the ironsmith. It's just a man making, and he's a weak man at that. And the carpenter, just a man. And he's making, oh, by the way, about this wood and these trees, verse 15. Then it becomes fuel for a man. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. He makes a god and worships it. He makes it in an idol and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over the half he eats meat. He roasts it and is satisfied. Also he warms himself and says, aha, I am warm. I've seen the fire. And the rest of it he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, deliver me, for you are my God. Do you see the senseless nature of this? The one that's making the god is just a man. And what is he making it out of? In the case of the wood, he goes at length to describe the fact that it's just a tree. And while he might make an idol out of part of the tree, he's also then making a fire to warm himself, or making a fire so that he can cook his food. There is nothing special about that tree. That tree is not sacred in and of itself. It's just a tree, and he is just a man, and somehow just a man and just a tree make a god? See the ridiculous nature of this. Then verse 18, they know not. Now he's talking about the idols. They know not, nor do they discern, for he has shut their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so they cannot understand. So here's the idol. He can't see, he can't hear, he can't understand. A dumb idol, if you would. Verse 19, no one considers, nor is there knowledge or discernment to say, half of it I burned in the fire, I also baked bread on its coals, I roasted meat and have eaten, and shall I make the rest of it an abomination? So people aren't even questioning it. Verse 20, he feeds on ashes, a deluded heart has led him astray, and he cannot deliver himself or say, is there not a lie in my right hand? Idols, verse 4. An idol has no real existence, or an idol is nothing. And you'd have to say Isaiah would well agree with that statement. We know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. The Lord our God is one God. You read that in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. All good Jewish children would have learned such. You know, if you go to the Ten Commandments, the very first, what does it begin with? There's no God besides me. Don't make those graven images. Don't bow down or worship them. Well, as Paul says, there's no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods, so-called little g, O-D-S, so-called gods in heaven and on earth. Now, one thing I was reading that I thought was kind of interesting, it was suggesting that the so-called gods, and of course the reference there would be to idolatry, but as he mentions, the so-called gods in heaven being these various Greek gods and goddesses, and then the gods on earth being the Roman emperors to be deified. Now, how accurate that would be to say this is what Paul meant by so-called gods in heaven and on earth, I can't really say. I do think it's an interesting consideration of the so-called gods in heaven and on earth. But clearly this, the so-called God. An idol has no real existence. There's no God but one God. He puts, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. Once again, lowercase g, O-D-S. These would be those so-called gods. But then that declaration in verse 6, yet for us there is one God. Paul can say, along with the Corinthian brethren, there is one God and idols are nothing. I think it's interesting to see now the little snippet he says about the one God. He says, one God the Father, from whom are all things. Most people could quote Genesis 1:1, couldn't they? For God created heavens and the earth. That's how it begins. That's from whom are all things. Then notice that next phrase. For whom we exist. You know, this ought to really cause our ears to perk up a little bit. And he's talking directly to us. For whom we exist. There's a lot of things that vie for our time, our attention. A lot of things that we give our energies over to in this life. There are things that we just get in a stew about. But you know, it says, we exist for God, for whom we exist. My time, my attention, my energies. And we realize there's a lot of things, like I say, that vie for our time, our attention, our energies. But let it have that basis and platform of God. Somebody says, well, school's starting back. I'll be spending 7 hours a day at school. Sounds like I exist for school. No. You exist for God, even if you're at school. I work long hours, somebody says. It's not uncommon to be a 10-hour day. Someone says, well, I've got 12-hour days. And somebody else may even say, I frequently work doubles, 16-hour days. Still, you're still existing for God, even if you're at that job. So he talks about God the Father, for whom we exist, then says, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. In Colossians 1:15 and 16, you find there the reference to Jesus as creator. John 1, about verse 3, same thing. And actually, if you were to take your Bible and search, it's not right here within this, not in the scope of what Paul is saying here, but you find even the Spirit having some attributes with regards to creation. God the Father, from whom are all things, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. You know, these verses, there's no idols or nothing. It's all about God, and we're to be all about God. Idols or nothing. Now verse 7, however, not all possess this knowledge. There's not everybody is kind of fully understanding and up on the idea idols are strictly idols and are nothing. Some people may have come out of it. And even though they kind of acknowledge it, there's still this emotional baggage, you might say, with regards to the idols and the idolatry that they had practiced and eating the food offered to idols. They don't quite have the same knowledge and understanding. Not all possess this knowledge. Then he says, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. An idol's nothing. And somebody says, okay, the idol's nothing, and so if the food's offered to idols, I know the idol's nothing. So what could be wrong with me eating? Somebody else, they don't quite have that knowledge. And they, through their former association, they've been used to eating the food offered to idols kind of like as their worship. And so they eat the food offered to idols, and it says their conscience being weak is defiled. Then he talks about food. He says, food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat it, and no better off if we do. So food is food is food. If this had been food that had been offered to an idol, the idol's nothing and it's still food. The implication, you can eat of that food. The idol's nothing. Food is food. You're not better if you eat it. You're not better if you don't eat it. Verse 9 puts it all in perspective. Take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Now, one thing that is interesting to do in chapters 8, 9, and 10 is to go through, and every time you see the idea of right or power or authority, kind of take note of it, maybe underline it. Because there's the element of we got rights. We as Americans, if somebody says first 10 amendments, what are they? Bill of Rights. And okay, you're like me probably. It's been so long since you've been out of school. Somebody starts saying, okay, what is the blank amendment? I forgot. But on the other hand, there's 2 or 3 because there's so much in the news, as it were, occasionally that, I remember that one. We're a country of, I've got my rights. And he's making the point. Okay, the food, idol's nothing. Food's food. You're not better if you eat it. You're not better if you don't eat it. You've got the right to eat it. But you take care. You be careful that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. You know what he's saying here? He's saying that this brother is more important than the right that you have. Oh, but that steak looks so good. But if you know that it's going to cause the brother to stumble, it's a reason to forgo. Verse 10, if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? And one thing to point out is right here you have mentioned eating in an idol's temple. When you get over to chapter 10, 25 through chapter 11, 1, it's concerning idols' meat, idols' food that's eaten at home. So there's kind of a couple of things going on within this entire context, but it's like, okay, an idol's nothing, so what if I'm here? It's nothing. Food's food. You're not better if you eat it. You're not better if you don't eat it. So why can't I? But if you're seen at the idol's temple, and it's a brother who, he's come out of that, and he struggles with it. And maybe he misses his friends that are there. Maybe he misses kind of the warm fuzzies he has when he's there. And for him to go back, it's not a matter of an idol's nothing. It's not a matter of food is food. It's a matter of the idol is a god. And that food offered to an idol is almost like your worship to him. You see, verse 11. So by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed. The brother for whom Christ died. That's key to remember. It's not about your rights. It's about that brother. And for whom Christ died. Okay, let's see. Jesus gave up heaven. Jesus gave up even home. Jesus gave up. He gave up his life on the cross for that brother, and you won't give up eating those meats at the idol's temple for that brother? Can you see the direction here and the logic here? If he was that important to Jesus, this brother's got to be that important to me. And how important is a brother? 1 Corinthians is a good place to study that. You know, the first 3 chapters, division. And Jesus doesn't want that division among brothers. You get over to chapter 5, and it's about this brother, and he's with his father's wife, and we get to the point of, with such an one know not to eat, disciplinary action taken. Why? So that the spirit may be saved. In other words, it's to gain him back. You know what we get here, and we're talking about, see the importance of the brother. You get over when you're talking about miraculous spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and he talks about the body and about these various body parts, and you come away with, the brother is so very important. Just so tired. Won't he learn? It's exasperating that I've got to give up. I know better that I've got to give up when there's nothing to it. And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed. The brother for whom Christ died. Thus, now look at this. Sinning against your brothers. You don't care that you could be a stumbling block to them, even though you're convinced the whole time you're doing the right thing. And maybe you are doing the right thing. There's a special circumstance here. He doesn't have the knowledge. You can be a stumbling block. Thus, sinning against your brothers. That's Paul's consideration. And wounding their conscience when it is weak. And then he says these words. You sin against Christ. That's how important this brother is. You give up even your right, if necessary, to win and gain that brother. Look at verse 13. This kind of concludes it all. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Paul was concerned about his brother. Concerning the food offered to idols, kind of in a more specific way in this context, eating in an idol's temple, verse 10. The idol's nothing. The food, you're not better if you eat it. You're not better if you don't eat it. But if in so doing, you harm your brother, become a stumbling block to him, you sin against him and you sin against Christ. So, Paul's attitude, it's going to make my brother stumble. I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Our brother's that important. As we close, if we could assist you in your obedience tonight, the gospel of Jesus Christ, its message, the grace of God, it's for all. If you need to with faith, turn from your sin to confess that faith, and then be baptized into Christ, we'd be glad to assist you tonight. If there's need for prayer, please come as we stand and sing.